I'm making this video now in reference to a Facebook post which asked about the question about exhuming a body from a Jewish cemetery because the cemetery stopped, or the shul that's associated with the cemetery association, or whatever it is, left Orthodoxy. The story that I'm going to bring, a case, case law on many different levels, is the exact opposite, but it could bring some references as to what exactly, some ideas to answer this question. I think this question was posed as a hypothetical question, but in any event, this is an actual historical case. I believe it took place in 1935, if I'm not mistaken. It was sometime in the 30s. That in Richmond, Virginia, which I later served as a Rav in Richmond, Virginia, many years later, of course. In Richmond, Virginia, I used to go and visit the kever of a Rav who lived there, Yecheskel Pavlevich. This is how I found out this story. I don't have very much information about Rav Pavlevich, but I knew that he was there and he died without any children. So I used to go there, especially on his yard site. And other times, sometimes I felt that I wanted to daven by the kever of a rabbi, Kibbutz Tzadikim, what we had in Richmond. And also in the same cemetery was the story which took place was Reverend Goldman, who was a shochet, a Talmud who lived in Richmond. And this Reverend Goldman, he when he was nifter, he was buried in that same cemetery where later Rav Pavlevich would be buried. It was called Sir Moses Montefiore. That was an Orthodox congregation in Richmond at the time. And now that cemetery, the Sir Moses congregation, merged with two other congregations eventually over history to become Knesset Beth Israel, which is an Orthodox congregation there, the largest Orthodox congregation in Richmond. I was a Rav in a congregation called Emes, which became a Young Israel branch, but it was too frum for its own good and just was shrinking and shrinking. But now, Baruch Hashem, the building is still in Jewish hands. It's a girls' Orthodox Jewish high school. In any event, excuse me, can you be quiet? In any event, the story goes that this Reverend Goldman was a shochet. That was, the title. It was often given to shachtim and moalim and cantors because they weren't ordained rabbis, but they were ordained clergy, so they were called reverend in those days. I would like to see, in a way, perhaps that title come back into the Jewish community. I've written about that, although it was edited out in one particular article I wrote that was published. And this, we could call him Rabbi Goldman. He was buried in Moses Cemetery, an Orthodox cemetery. He was a frum Jew, a very pious, devoted Orthodox Jew, and a Talmud Chacham, a shochet, Yer Shemayim. Unfortunately, after he was nifter, after he passed away, his wife and children became Reform, and they joined the old Reform congregation, which also still exists, and his wife was buried in the Reform cemetery at the behest of the children. And the children made a request that Reverend Goldman's body should be exhumed and placed in the Reform cemetery, since their family were now members of the Reform temple. It's called Beth Ahava is the name of the Reform temple there that this cemetery was affiliated with. So anyway, and it's also an old congregation, goes back before the Civil War, and they, in a sense, they merged with a previous congregation, Orthodox congregation, a Sephardic congregation actually, that was a colonial, era, was the sixth congregation in America, was Beth Shalom, in 1791, I believe, is when it was founded. In any event, it went to court, to civil court, this question of whether or not to exhume this man's body, and very interestingly, although I mentioned on Facebook, Ein Karim Tzadik Etzel Rasha, you don't bury a righteous person and a wicked person together. That's a different story, but they didn't bring that up in this particular case. But another question here was as follows: so they wanted to exhume the father and bury him next to the mother, and the Orthodox rabbis. One rabbi came from Petersburg, Virginia, an Orthodox rabbi. I don't remember his name now. And then the other rabbi was the chief rabbi there in Richmond, Rabbi Cheskel Pavlovich. And they both testified as follows. They said that the Code of Jewish Law states that you do not exhume a husband to be next to his wife, but you can exhume a wife to be next to her husband. And you can dig up from the cemetery. Exhume means to dig up someone from the cemetery. And to bury them back, so you could say they're buried in two different cemeteries. You could dig up the wife to put and move her to the husband, but you can't dig up the husband to move next to the wife. And they testified as follows. They said that the Code of Jewish Law was written some 400 or 500 years ago, based on the Talmud, which is in turn based on the Bible. And that's how they both testified. The Reform rabbi came up to give his testimony, and he testified as follows. He said, "Your Honor, most of the Jewish people have already repudiated the Code of Jewish Law that these old Orthodox rabbis cling to, just as the Protestant Reformation repudiated Catholicism." That was how he expressed himself. That was how he shot himself in the foot, basically, because the judge said, "Well, you answered my question now. I see Reform Judaism and Orthodox Judaism are two different religions. I wouldn't go and exhume someone from a Catholic cemetery and put him in a Protestant cemetery, or vice versa. And so the same here. I'm not going to exhume an Orthodox Jew and place him in a Reform cemetery." For this, and so Reverend Goldman remained there in Sir Moses Cemetery, and I visited his grave quite a few times. I remember actually one of his family members passed away while I was there in Richmond. I would often go to various funerals to help with the minyan and so forth, at the request of Rabbi Yalkut, who was the Rav at the time in KBI, and I remember that some of his family members, indeed, even though they were not observant, did also bury in Sir Moses Cemetery near their great-grandfather. As far as this particular question, it's possible to say this issue of Ein Karim Tzadik Etzel Rasha could justify exhuming the body in the case of where the cemetery left Orthodoxy, but a more likely approach would be to place some kind of a mechitza around this particular grave to separate it from the other graves around it. That would probably be the best approach for that question, but perhaps if it were a case, as we saw, they quoted Shulchan Aruch there in the story that I brought, that if the case was that the one that they want to exhume was the wife, and husband perhaps was still alive, and the husband purchased a plot elsewhere, then after the husband passed and was buried in this new plot, and perhaps they purchased a new plot as well for the wife, there would certainly be justification to move the wife next to her husband. That's one possibility. But let's say both of the parents have already passed and they're both buried there. If you want to, as was mentioned in the discussion, if you want to move them to Eretz Yisrael, the Holy Land, that's certainly a justification to exhume the bodies and bring them to the Holy Land to be reburied, which was done with many tzaddikim. I remember when I lived in Yerushalayim, I visited the kever of the Chida, who was not, I believe was originally buried in Morocco, but there's his kever in Eretz Yisrael. He was moved to Eretz Yisrael. There's also a kever of the Ben Ish Chai in Yerushalayim, which I'm not sure if he was actually moved or not. I would assume the Ben Ish Chai was buried in Baghdad originally, although I'm not sure the exact history there. And many other tzaddikim were exhumed and moved to Eretz Yisrael. Also, if the cemetery is going to be destroyed, there's permission, of course, to exhume the body and move it, as was famously done with the Vilna Gaon. That the cemetery had to be moved, and they only allowed a certain number of graves to be moved, and the rest were totally destroyed, but at least the Gaon of Vilna was moved, and they built a beautiful ohel for him and so forth. Baruch Hashem, his kever was saved. And so, there are various answers that we could give to this. Of course, you'd have to speak to a competent posek to receive an actual psak halacha, but these are things that we could discuss in before rendering such a psak, as far as these questions are concerned. All right, and of course, this video was made for this Facebook post, but I hope if anybody else saw it, they enjoyed it. I said more than I would have written in a comment. And thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. God bless.